China. With what's going on in the world lately, a lot of people have been bringing up and talking about the potential issue of China regarding Taiwan. China's claim over Taiwan and Taiwan's claim over China is essentially a territorial dispute. In case you don't know, a territorial dispute is a disagreement over the possession or control of a territory, be it land or sea, between two or more countries. And so this got me thinking, does China have any other territorial disputes? And as it turns out, yes, it does, and a lot. It used to have a lot more, which could be a good sign. They're actively trying to resolve them through diplomatic means. But the ones they have now are still many and, in a lot of cases, potentially very problematic. I'll mention the previous disputes as well, but before that, let's take a look at the current territorial disputes that China has today, which they are, what countries they dispute territory with, and why. China has 5 main territorial disputes with 9 different countries. Although with some countries there are many other smaller disputes over details on the border, but for this video we're going to focus on the main ones as they are much more significant. The countries involved in China's territorial disputes are Bhutan, India, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, the last 4 being disputes in regard to the South China Sea. Starting with the Bhutan border. China's dispute with Bhutan has to do with its occupation of Tibet. Bhutan has always had strong connections to Tibet, being neighboring countries for much of their history. However, Bhutan's border with Tibet was never officially recognized and marked, and so when China occupied Tibet in 1949, they also occupied a number of exclaves which were ruled by Bhutan, despite being within Tibetan territory. They had been given to Bhutan by Tibetan Prince Ngawang Namgyal in the 17th century, and so the dispute began, with China exerting control over the lands, but Bhutan claiming them as their own. In 1984, they began yearly talks to try to resolve this issue, but have not yet succeeded in doing so. The most they achieved was an agreement to maintain peace on the border from 1998 onwards. However, even this was at risk of collapsing, as tensions increased when China began to build roads and infrastructure on these occupied territories. But thankfully it seems to be on its way to being resolved. Then the border with India. When it comes to land disputes, this is definitely the most important one. China has a few border disputes with India, 2 main ones and then several small ones. The 2 main ones are, first, Aksai Chin, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these, under Chinese control and located on the India-China-Pakistan border. According to the Ardagh-Johnson line, the official boundary for India would include this region. However, the Chinese did not recognize that boundary and so used it to build a road connecting their controlled territories of Xinjiang and Western Tibet, declaring it as their own territory. And second, Arunachal Pradesh, essentially this yellow area east of Bhutan, controlled by India but claimed by China. China's argument for this one is that the border was drawn across the McMahon Line, the boundary between Tibet and British India, as agreed between the two in 1914. China says it does not recognize that agreement, which was the Simla Convention, and so the colonial border should not be applied today, with Tibet being entitled to this area and China as its ruler entitled to it as well. The 1962 Sino-Indian War was fought in both disputed areas. Chinese troops attacked Indian border posts in Ladakh in the west and crossed the McMahon Line in the east. There was a brief border clash in 1967 in the region of Sikkim, but in 1987 and 2013, potential conflicts over the 2 differing lines of actual control were successfully de-escalated. However, the result of the war was that China was able to maintain its control over Aksai Chin, while India maintained its rule over Arunachal Pradesh. Some border skirmishes and provocations still take place from time to time, and this issue is not yet close to being resolved. Before we go on with the video, I want to thank the sponsor of this video and great friend of the channel, Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that allows you to read and learn even when you might not have the time to do it. What they do is great because they take thousands of non-fiction books and summarize their content into short, around 15 minutes, listening or reading sessions. If you are a regular watcher of the channel, you already know this, but I'm not only sponsored by them, I'm actually also a user of their app. I've been listening to this great series they have called Bedtime Biographies, where you can quickly learn about some of the most interesting figures throughout history. Right now, I'm on Napoleon's. His is divided into 4 really simple and summarized chapters. And there's a bunch of other cool ones like Genghis Khan, Eleanor Roosevelt, Marie Curie, Toussaint Louverture, Marie Antoinette, and several others really interesting historical figures. If you want to try it out, go to blinkist.com/general knowledge and you'll get 1 free week to try it out and then 25% off if you want to continue on with your membership. One of the countries China has had territorial disputes with for the longest time is Japan. They argue over the Senkaku, the Yaoi Islands, and the Ryukyu Islands. Japan argues that it surveyed the islands in the late 19th century and found them to be deserted and belonging to no one. At the time, China accepted and Japanese sovereignty prevailed. However, after 1970, China began to argue that documentary evidence prior to the First Sino-Japanese War indicated Chinese possession and that because of this, it had not been discovered and populated by Japan, but in fact occupied. And because of this, it would have had to have been returned in 1945, as did all other conquests by the defeated Imperial Japan. Apparently, part of the islands were owned by private individuals, and in 2012, the Japanese government bought them, which caused China to protest. And some say this situation is the most serious risk of military conflict between the two nations since the 20th century. The islands are included within the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan, meaning that if China attacked, the US would have to come to Japan's defense and intervene. And of course, the dispute it has with Taiwan itself, which oddly is the simplest one out of this list. The People's Republic of China claims the administration of what they call Taiwan Province, as well as the mainland nearby islands of Kinmen and Matsu, currently controlled by the Republic of China. This dispute stems from the Chinese internal conflict, in which the PRC was victorious, driving the Republic of China out of the continent and withdrawing into the island of Taiwan. Neither of the sides took the conflict as fully resolved, and so each still claims the other one's land. This is something that not many people talk about. It's not just China claiming Taiwan, it's technically Taiwan also claiming China, but obviously there's no realistic way of the Republic recovering the mainland, while Chinese invasion of Taiwan is a realistic risk. Also, Taiwan simultaneously has the same territorial claims as China does with other countries which the mainland borders. But these claims, as well as the technical claim on the mainland, are not de facto claims by Taiwan, and it seems their only real claim is the status quo and their continued sovereignty over the islands that they now control. And finally, the South China Sea dispute, in which Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines are also involved. This is arguably the biggest territorial dispute that China is involved in, and the one at the highest risk of military conflict emerging from it, seconded by the one with India. An estimated $3.37 trillion worth of global trade passes through the South China Sea every year, about 1/3 of the global maritime trade. 80% of China's energy imports and around 40% of its total trade passes through it as well. So you can see why it's so important to them. The issue is many countries, the one we just listed, claim parts of the sea territory as well as the Spratly and Paracel Islands, and their claims overlap. We can see it on this map where each colored line represents the claim of one country. The claimant countries not only wish to control the shipping lanes of the area through which that great amount of trade passes, but also to retain or acquire fishing rights, as well as the exploration of potential oil and gas reserves, not to mention the general issue of maritime security. What many of those countries do is build artificial islands in order to further their claim, but the claims on the natural islands themselves are a complete mess. Look at this chaotic map of the ownership of the Spratly Islands. It's insane. The islands themselves are not that relevant, but the important resources under the sea, oil and gas, are. This dispute goes back a long time to the colonial period when the Spratly Islands and the Paracels were surveyed by Germany in 1883. China issued protests against them, even at the time. China then sent naval forces on inspection tours in 1902 and placed flags and markers on them to claim the islands. They were occupied by Japan during World War II, and while they were forced to give them up after being defeated, no recipient was specified. Apparently, countries are entitled to territory 200 nautical miles from their land, and this established all of these countries' claims, but it seems China's claim seeks to go further than that. So now that we've listed and generally understood the current main disputes, what about recently resolved ones? There were at least 10 additional past ones. I'll quickly mention them, although not getting into much detail. First, Kazakhstan. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan became an independent country and around 2,500 square kilometers of land was disputed with China. A border treaty between the two nations was signed in 1994. China received around 22% of the total disputed territory and Kazakhstan the remaining 78%. Kyrgyzstan had the same issue. The dispute came from internal opposition in Kyrgyzstan, which did not agree to the deal the president at the time had made with China. It even contributed to a full-blown revolution, the Tulip Revolution. In 2009, they finally resolved it, each giving up a part of their claim. Mongolia was part of Qing China, but the newly founded People's Republic of China recognized the independence of Outer Mongolia due to the two nations sharing a similar ideology in the 1950s. Later on, with the Sino-Soviet split, Mongolia aligned itself with the Soviet Union and asked for the deployment of Soviet forces, leading to security concerns in China along their border, but the issue has apparently since been resolved. However, Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region within Mongolia, has been involved in a territorial dispute with China, with the last moment of border tension having taken place in 2015. But it seems not to be an issue between the two states and just a regional thing. Myanmar had a small issue with China over their border as well. This was because their initial border had been negotiated between China and the British Empire. At the time, the territory was British Burma and somewhat incorporated into the British Raj. So after World War II and Burmese independence, the border had to be renegotiated, with some issues in attaining an agreement. Then Nepal. Several treaties were negotiated between Nepal and Qing China in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, the treaties were often vague and didn't specify a specific delimitation for the border. So after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Chinese and Nepalese governments had to define the border. There is no current conflict according to both nations. However, the Nepalese opposition leader apparently claims there is. North Korea is friendly to China, but at one time they had somewhat of a territorial dispute as well. They share a 1,400-kilometer long land border that corresponds almost entirely to the course of the Yalu and Tumen rivers. However, there was a part of the border that didn't follow along the rivers and so was partially claimed by both. The two countries signed a border treaty in 1962 to resolve their undemarcated land border. China received 40% of the land and North Korea held the rest. The issue with Pakistan was similar to the one China has with India. In fact, it was precisely in the same area. In the 1950s, they reached a mutual agreement. China recognized Pakistani sovereignty in one area, ceding over 1,900 square kilometers of land to them, and in exchange, Pakistan recognized Chinese sovereignty over hundreds of square kilometers of land in northern Kashmir and Ladakh. China also had a few border issues with Russia, but most were inherited by other nations when the Soviet Union collapsed. The remaining were eventually resolved with Russia through diplomacy and exchange of territory. Another case is Tajikistan. China had a long-standing territorial claim on a large portion of Tajik territory since 1884, which was taken from the Qing dynasty by what the Qing claimed were unequal treaties. In 2011, as a part of a boundary agreement, China officially relinquished its claim on 96% of the total disputed territory, while Tajikistan ceded around 4%. And finally, a small but still significant dispute also existed with South Korea. They were in an argument over the Socotra Rock in the East China Sea, which they both claim as part of their exclusive economic zone. However, it apparently is just a submerged reef, which according to UN law cannot be claimed as territory by any nation. In 2006, China said South Korea's actions were illegal, but then in 2013 they confirmed they no longer had a territorial dispute over it. So those are the territorial disputes of China today and in the past, some of land and some of sea. Some very minor and having to deal with small details, and others being major issues which could, especially in the two cases of the India dispute and the South China Sea dispute, lead to some type of escalation of conflict. Are there any other territorial disputes that China has with other countries, or any additional information or corrections regarding the ones I mentioned? Let me know in the comments along with your opinions about this. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.